So our next two sessions, in fact, will be touching on the topic of creation and evolution. And although this is called an introduction, and this may be a topic that you think you've discussed to death, hopefully you'll be getting a slightly different slant on things this afternoon. So it's a double act between two speakers. You've already seen Ruth Bancewicz up front, who's our church engagement director. I think she introduced herself to those of you online. If those in the room, hopefully you've met her over lunch, but just to give you a little more background, Ruth is a biologist. She studied genetics for both her undergraduate and her PhD, where she studied in Aberdeen and Edinburgh, as you may tell from the accent. And Ruth has been at the Faraday since it was founded in 2006. She's got a wealth of experience in writing and speaking on science and faith issues. And as you heard already, that she's particularly been focused on developing resources for churches to support churches to engage well with science. And our other speaker for this session is Hugh Rollinson. Oh, sorry, I failed to introduce myself. I'm Sarah Parrott. I'm the course director at the Faraday, and I'm delighted to introduce also Hugh Rollinson, who is my predecessor as course director. Hugh is a geologist. He's still an emeritus professor at the University of Derby, although he's now living in Birmingham. Before he was the course director here, he has worked in many countries around the world as a geologist, including Sierra Leone, Zimbabwe, and Oman. And Hugh's academic interests are on the more physical side of science, particularly the first 2 billion years of Earth's history, which he calls early part of Earth's history, and looking at how the Earth's continental crust was formed. So I'm now going to hand over to Hugh and Ruth to lead this next session.
Thank you very much, Sarah. You'll be pleased to know I'm not going to talk to you about the technical things. In fact, this talk is very much pastoral in its intent and in its focus. Let me just start with one or two quotes to give you some context for what I want to say. Here's a quote written by a young scientist a few months ago. He wrote about how as an undergraduate, he really struggled to work out what to do with the evidence for evolution. He was studying biology, and this was heightened as two of my biology professors were using it as a means to attack Christianity in a way which I felt with hindsight was completely inappropriate. Here's Philip Pullman, the author of His Dark Materials, which is currently on the television. After I'd learned a little science at school, the 6 days of creation and the miracles vanished, and only God himself was left, although silence on his part was complete. Here's a quote from a friend of mine who's a research associate here in the Faraday Institute, talking about a colleague who'd hosted some meetings with church and community leaders in South Africa. And the message that came back from these meetings was twofold: that the conflict thesis, the dichotomy between science and religion, and the prosperity gospel. And then he speaks about the fact that parents and church leaders were in tears over the impact of this conflict thesis, this conflict between science and faith was having on their young people. So much so there's a hemorrhaging of youth leaving the churches and leaving families and leaving the faith. And that's my concern in this talk. If we teach young people the wrong stuff, then we will suffer in our churches as a consequence. And so what I want to do today is talk about myself and tell you my own personal story as a young person growing up in a conservative Christian evangelical home, and yet studying geology in the sixth form at school. So here's me of uncertain age, but as a teenager with my family, And these are some of the early influences on me as a young Christian, growing up with parents in a Brethren assembly in York, and then moving some years later to a free evangelical church. My dad left his job in local government and set up a Christian bookshop in York, the Barbican Bookshop, named after one of the city's gateways in York. And so I was part of a Christian family that were well known. My dad was well respected as a Christian businessman, and this had a strong influence on my early development. But to say that growing up in a loving Christian home was dull is completely wrong, because there were aspects of our Christian young people's work were real fun and extremely exciting. You've probably never heard of Old Rome unless you live in somewhere like Hull, but we used to go to boys' crusader camps in a village called Old Rome on the crumbling east coast of Yorkshire, one of the most least desirable holiday locations in the UK. But we just used to have a great time. It was a very Christian set of camps, but there was a whole load of fun, which made the idea of going year after year to these camps very appealing. Slightly more scary as I got older was joining a young people's youth group that went out and did street preaching. This is King Square in York, as it is today, a site of local entertainment for the tourist industry. But if you can imagine a dark night when people are moving from pub to pub, and we were there literally on a soapbox preaching to people. They didn't stand, they just walked by and made rude noises about what we were doing. But it was, if you like, a way to cut your teeth that was in some ways quite scary. But also in York at the time was a young minister who'd come to start a new church to reach what was then the new university in York, a chap called David Watson, and people in the room of a certain age or online of a certain age will recognize the name. And he was a very important influence in my life from his speaking and his writing, even though I wasn't actually a member of his church. So just to quickly summarize my background, I come from a deeply biblical tradition where the view of scripture is extremely high. Living as part of a community of people in a church and in a family where there is a strong devotional tradition seeking to honestly live out scripture, but with a very strong emphasis on evangelism and on Christian outreach. Now, let's set this aside alongside some of the scientific influences that pertain to my life when I was a young person. I was studying geology in the sixth form. It was one of those unusual schools that actually taught geology. And so I was learning an awful lot about fossils. And of course, living in Yorkshire, we have the Yorkshire coast, particularly places like Whitby, full of fossil assemblages such as these ammonites and so on. And so it was very natural for me to be interested in the outdoor world. And in this particular case, my geology started with an understanding of fossils, and they very much became part of my life. Now, interestingly, just to move on a few years, as an undergraduate, I got involved as a research assistant in a research project in northern Norway. And my understanding of the importance of fossils deepened very rapidly. In geology at the time, and we're talking 40, maybe even 50 years ago now, there was something of a dilemma, because as we looked at the fossil record, we saw that suddenly the rocks had no fossils, and then they appeared almost as if it were overnight. At 540 million years, what's known as the Cambrian explosion, suddenly creatures with hard parts appeared in the fossil record, and they've been there ever since. And this research project in Norway was looking at that transition over that period of time, before and after. And what we noticed was, or what the scientists I was working with noticed, was that it's not true that suddenly fossils appeared in the record. There was a vast record of life well before 540 million years. This so-called Cambrian explosion was no such thing. It's just that the fossils recorded didn't have hard parts, and so they were more difficult to preserve. So these pictures of things like worm burrows and soft-bodied animals like jellyfish that under the right conditions were being preserved. So I was learning about fossils. I was also learning about geological time. Here's the Grand Canyon, and we can see the strata there organized from old at the bottom of the canyon to younger at the top of the canyon. And one of the things we learn in geology, and subsequently I used to teach students of geology, was how to make a geological map. And this is all about trying to work out which rocks are the oldest, which rocks are the younger, and how they've changed, how these strata have developed and changed as the rocks have got bent and folded and so on. And then I learned about geological dating and about the evidence for deep geological time using the methods of isotope dating and lots of really complicated and fascinating machinery. And here's an example of how this system works. These are some rocks I collected, interestingly, in Zimbabwe. From these rocks, we collect little tiny crystals of the mineral zircon, which has an unusually large amount of the element uranium in them. And we use the decay, the principle of radioactive decay of uranium to lead in these crystals, and then measure it in this equipment here. And to cut what is a very complex and tedious story short, out pops a number. And in this case, the rocks from that outcrop have an age of thereabouts 2649 million years. And this is, the, if you like, the process of radioactive dating that I was learning about as a boy. Now we put all this information together, the sequence of strata, the fossils, the dating and so on, and from that we build what we call the geological timescale. And so again, this is stuff that I was learning as a boy in the sixth form, which combines all this information. And so on the geological timescale, at a certain age, about 195 million years, we can slot in feathered birds or feathered dinosaurs, the transition between the two. If we go back in time to about 400 million years, we see the first insects, we see early plants in the record. And so what I was learning, if you like, to summarize my scientific understanding in that age was that fossils are real and they provide a record of ancient life on Earth. And this life evolved from more simple organisms to more complex organisms. I also learned that the Earth has a very long history. The Earth is very old, and there was therefore time for life to evolve. But as I began to think about this, combining now my scientific understanding and my Christian understanding, particularly my biblical Christian understanding, I came across two dilemmas. The first was this: as I sought to put the geological record next to the Genesis record, and so we got on the right-hand side of the slide the days of Genesis, and I'm seeing how they might tie up with the sequence of events that we see in the geological record. I found a real problem. I found that the Genesis account does not match the geological account. And so what I'm showing with these blue arrows is the way in which the linkages might have been made. And as you can see, they are in no form of sequence that matches the sequence that we find in the geological record. So in other words, what I was finding as I read my Bible did not match what I was learning in my scientific studies. And then there was something else that I came across. This is a very unusual set of fossils from South Africa, where it looks as though probably about 10 or 15 million years ago, a whole group of animals must have got caught in a storm and all drowned together and were found in this amazing fossil bone bed. But it became clear to me as I thought and learned about the fossil record that there was evidence for death, and there are one or two very unusual fossils where you can see evidence for carnivorous activity, for predation, if you like, long before humans appeared on the surface of the earth. And so for me, this was my second dilemma, because it led me to wonder about what does the fall mean when we read about it in Genesis and then read about how Paul understands it in Romans, that death, sin and death came into the world. As sin entered the world, so death came into the world. And yet it was clear to me that death was in the world a long, long time before human beings entered the world. So these were my two dilemmas: not being able to match the reading of Genesis with my understanding of the geological history of the earth, and then this understanding about death. Death had been very much part of the fossil record. And so I was facing the dilemma that I believe many young people still today face when they study science. They may not see it through the lens of geology, as I did, but still they face the dilemma. And for many young people, it's a crunch time. It's a choice time. What am I going to do? Am I going to ditch my science and just somehow cling on to Jesus? Or am I going to ditch my Bible, my faith, my following Jesus? Now, we could just pause there for a moment, because that's all I wanted to say, and maybe just ask you to think, maybe just turn to the person next to you for 1 minute. If you were my pastor, what would you be saying to me? How would you help me come through this apparent dilemma? I know there are people watching online, and I don't want to have a long break because you'll get bored, but maybe we could just take 1 minute to talk to the person next to you and give an instant off-the-cuff response as to what you would say to me when I was 18. Okay, well, thank you. That just gets the conversation going. In a moment, I'm going to hand over to Ruth. Yes, it clearly got the conversation going, but I'm very conscious that there are people watching online, and we don't want to leave them in limbo. Before I hand over to Ruth, any questions of clarity over what I've said? We can have a fuller discussion after Ruth's given her half of the talk, but was there anything I said that just didn't make sense? Yes. Sorry, we need a microphone, do we? So it's the gentleman on the front.
Am I right in saying for geology, the newer rocks are on the top?
Yes.
How do they get there?
Well, they get laid down on top of the older rocks.
How? From what?
Okay.
I thought it came out of volcanic activity, which comes from below.
Even if it came from a volcano, it tends to come up through the old volcano
and then drop
spread out on top. So even with volcanoes, the older lavas tend to be at the bottom and the new ones keep coming out to the surface. But if we're talking about the sea, which is probably the case of the Grand Canyon, then you've got the seabed and the sand forms on the rocks underneath, and then more sand lies on top of that, and so on and so on.
Good.
Okay, there's one more quick question, Ruth, behind you.
Hi, Hugh. Earlier on, you said that all species came from an initial species that was a lot simpler form. What's your thoughts on when the Bible says that God created all creatures according to their specific species? What kind of species? Is that right? Kind, sorry.
Yeah. Well, where was I the other day? Oh, I took my grandchildren to the zoo. And for the first time, I think I must have thought what Darwin thought when he traveled the world. And he saw such a diversity of species, so many different animals, as you see in Dudley Zoo. And you just think, where has all this diversity come from? So there are kinds, if you like, there are groups, but trying to understand where is this breadth of animal kingdom come from? It's just the most incredible question. And he began to come up with an answer. So I'm not directly answering your question. I realize that. I'm doing what politicians do. I'm answering the question I would like somebody to ask me. But can we just leave it there for now? Yeah.
Hugh, there's a question online,
Yes.
which is the dating of animal life before man's existence was based on carbon dating technology created by science. What evidence do we have that the carbon dating technology is accurate?
Okay. Well, the sort of dating I'm talking about is radioactive dating. So it's not actually carbon dating. The quick answer is if we take a rock and date it using multiple methods and we get the same result, then clearly the method works because we're using a series of independent studies to get basically the same answer. Now, the science of geochronology is something that some people spend their whole careers on, and it's actually a bit more complicated. So I've given a rather simplistic answer, but it's a true answer, it's a fair answer. Okay, I think, look, I better stop there and hand on to Ruth, or else you won't have any time.
Yeah, we'll have more time for questions. You can hold on to that till the end.
Okay.
We're going to have more time for questions at the end. Now, do I have to come out of this and find mine? The one labeled Ruth. So we are going to hear from a theologian. You are, I'm doing both at the moment. It's really fun. Go from working at Faraday to training at Ridley Hall. I just want to give you some insights. We decided not to cover the sort of basics of science of the evolution creation questions because many of you have studied in theological colleges and have covered the doctrine of creation. If you haven't, I thoroughly recommend a systematic theology textbook by a guy called Tony Lane from London School of Theology, and they deal with the science very faithfully, I think, and with real fairness to the questions. I think is very helpful. What Hugh has done is passionately, I think, shared why I think we need to equip our congregations to think about this, how you do that in your setting. For some of you, that may be really easy. For others of you, it's just a matter of getting on with it. For others of you, it may be more sensitive. And the thing I would say is, please do it in some form or other, because otherwise some people will assume things that you don't agree with. They will fill the vacuum. There are probably plenty of stories around today about what happens when you leave a vacuum. And I know it can be difficult relationally. And again, you can chat to some of us afterwards about how we handle that. but I know it's challenging, but it's worth doing. This is me. You're getting everyone's pictures of in my red jumper phase with my family and some friends. And I inherited a real hodgepodge of ideas about science and faith. I actually avoided studying evolution at university. I thought nice Christian girls didn't do that kind of thing. And I'm really sad because it would have been really fascinating. I did learn it part of all my other courses. I kind of invented intelligent design, for those of you who know what that is, for myself as a PhD student, and then realized for lots of reasons why that wasn't a great idea. I'm still okay with evolution. Matt's taking some of the hardest questions per guy in the next talk. I know he'll love that. He's very well equipped to do that. And then there are more questions. And we also have Dennis Alexander here with us this weekend. He's speaking on bioethics, but if you're here in person, do ask him questions. He's got a great book called Creation or Evolution, Why Do We Have to Choose? But I think it all starts with the doctrine of creation. I don't know why some of these are an animation, but anyway. And I think this is the common ground that we have to get there. We have to have this conversation with Genesis 1 to 3 open in our Bibles, because a lot of what sometimes people say things and they're not in the text. They've made assumptions that are not in the text. And we have to have the doctrine of creation. You know, this is my summary from Alistair McGrath's Christian Theology, Popular Introduction to Systematic Theology. You know, some of you studied this in great depth. Some of you, will be familiar with this. These are some of the basics, and I think it's good to start with those and to talk about those and to affirm those, so that we're all on, when you're having a conversation about this, that you've got common ground. And also, I think it's helpful, even if you never mention science, to preach the doctrine of creation, because then people know what the essentials are. This is what it means to be a Christian. This is what creation means, and I think that's incredibly helpful. And also to teach people, and I know you will do this anyway, how to interpret the Bible. I think a lot of Hugh's problems were to do with the method of interpreting the Bible that saw it as a scientific book. The other thing I found very helpful is, we have the phrase, the elephant in the room. What's the elephant in the room? It's always, and for me, the elephant in the room of the discussion about creation and evolution is these three buckets, okay, where our thinking, and we need to be aware of what we are doing with these buckets and other people are in their thinking. There is the dogma bucket, or the gospel, or maybe you call it the primary issue or the closed hand. For Christian, one very easy thing that I think probably everyone who calls themselves a Christian, apart from Unitarians, would say that there's one triune God. Okay, that's a defining factor of being a Christian. And then there's the doctrine bucket. So your church, your denomination, there are distinctives for your church. It may be a view on baptism. It may be, I don't know what it is. For my church, one of them is openness to the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And then there's opinion. So different people in your church will have different views. Maybe different pastors in your denomination will have different views on this. And I would put views on how God created there. Okay. But different denominations, different individuals, different churches will put different stuff in the buckets. Okay. So views on the how of creation for Answers in Genesis and the Creation Research Organization, who do a lot of outreach on creation here, put them in the dogma bucket. Okay, and they'll link very closely how God created to the gospel, and they'll start their talks with that, and it's quite emotive, and there's a lot riding on it. And I work with young Earth creationists, and that's fine. But for someone who thinks it's part of the gospel, I can't work with them. That's just where my boundary is. I'll still love them, but I can't work with them. stereotypically, the more liberal the church is, the less there is in the dogma bucket, and vice versa. So, you know, and last time I showed this slide, I just moved swiftly on. But I actually want to pause on this and see what happens when we start to have a discussion about it. Because I think, without talking about other people's views or bad experiences we've had, but to talk about our views, can you think of one thing relating to the topic of creation and origins and that whole package of all the different things that are going on there? As a Christian, what you would put in the, one thing you would put in the dogma bucket, one thing you would put in the my church, or might be a thought experiment. If I was leading a church, I would put this in the distinctives bucket, and one thing you would put in the opinion bucket. Might be hard to put something in the middle bucket, actually, but anyway, dogma and opinion maybe. And then also to think about how you work with people who have different views. And I know this, you know, so this is the space that church leaders inhabit much of the time, but you may not have done it on this issue. So I'll leave with those two questions. What would you put in each bucket with respect to this topic? And how do you work with people who have different views? So we've got 10 minutes. I'd like to divide into groups of maybe 4 or 5 in the room, and then you're going to be put into breakout rooms. We'll give you 10 minutes and we'll just see what happens. Okay. So you can give me feedback later about whether that was a useful exercise that I should do again. Certainly in our group, we had some interesting conversations. And I know for some people, this is quite hard because we've got family members or people in our congregations who have very different views. And, you know, there's a difference between people you live with every day or you see in your church every single day and explaining your views and going in as a visiting speaker and talking about something and then running away again. There's different dynamics there. But for me, I find that helpful going into the conversation thinking, where do they put different things? You know, because I can't just say this isn't a gospel issue because it might be for them. And that's where denominational creeds and things could come in handy. But in a sense, I think these are the big questions we have to think through. The sort of decisions we have to make. Were the days in Genesis 24 hours? Personally, I would say if you think they are, you're making a category error. So you're reading the Bible in a scientific way. And I think a lot of church leaders and a lot of folk in this country are totally fine with a nuanced interpretation of Genesis 1 to 3. But obviously there'll be a bit of a difference. Question 2, did non-human organisms evolve? So if you remove humans out of the picture and just think about stuff, again, a lot of people are more comfortable with this thought, and maybe the things in the Bible happen more slowly if they're taking a concordist view, although as Hugh pointed out, they're in a different order. One of the biggies, this is where it gets difficult, is did humans evolve? Because it's to do with who we are and what our purpose is. And again, I think issues with that are, you know, we've got categories mixed up. And anyway, I'll let Matt talk about that. Were Adam and Eve actual people? I was just saying to someone, in the US for Christian colleges is often a boundary issue, and it's often in the dogma bucket, and it's one of those things that, you know, that people hold on to quite tightly. Where you put it, I don't know. And then the next question was the fall a one-time event that changed the physical properties of creation, including the onset of death and suffering? So the further along you go, you know, different people will put these things in doctrine or dogma buckets. The last one is, what is original sin? Who knows? I don't know. Don't ask me, ask Rowan Williams or someone very clever. But these are the sort of decisions people are making. And depending on your denomination, the first few questions may be a bit easier, or you may be right in with the flag right from question one. It depends where you are. But I think those are the decisions that those are the things we have to make decisions about. So again, that can be a useful list, and you can have these slides on Moodle afterwards. Now this, I'm just going to drop in a few nuggets that I find useful, as well as opening the Bible when we have discussions about Genesis 1 to 3, which is always a useful one because people say there are things in there and they're not there. Like the world was perfect, or humans are the only ones that got the breath of life. Oh, I've just preempted one of my slides. Anyway, but this is a really helpful nugget. Looking at the days, and probably many of you know this, there's the first 3 days, God forms spaces. Second 3 days, they are filled. This to me is an indication that this story is told. You can imagine people telling it aloud and kids learning it. And, you've got this framework for understanding, for God made all the things, as well as a lot of really doof kind of countercultural messages for people of that time. And that to me is one of the hints that although you have this rhythm, there was morning, there was evening, the first day, there's a hint that we're not talking about 24-hour days, not least that the sun is made on day 4. The other one is the ancient cosmology, which is very clearly used. If you read through Genesis in quite a literal translation, it will talk about the firmament. People believe this was the cutting edge science of the day. There was this firmament, and there was the seas below under Sheol, which is where the dead went, and there were the pillars of the earth with the seas below, the seas above, and there were holes in the firmament for the rain to come out, and the moon and the stars and things were sort of stuck on the firmament. That was the cutting edge science of the day. I wonder if God inspired Genesis 1 to 3 today, would it be in the beginning, bang, and then there was a singularity, or whatever, there were atoms and molecules, and then they can coalesce. And then for some people that would be quite an offensive statement, because there's strong feelings about science and religion about this topic. But I really genuinely wonder whether, looking at what's been done with this ancient cosmology in Genesis, this is a layer of the biblical story that is important in communicating the message to the people of that day, which is now confusing to us, and I think is not an essential part of the message. The essential part of the message is that God made all the things. He did it on purpose. He did it on his own, all the things we talked about in the doctrine of creation. The other one is, I'm straying onto Matt's territory, but he's seen the slides, it's all right. The use of, for example, really clever word play. So Adam, you've got this use of the word earth, and then a little bit later on, it's used to refer to humankind, and then the man. It depends a bit on your translation. When Adam becomes a personal name, it's not just the man, but that it's a personal name. This is the Hebrew Adamah, and Adamah meaning earth, and Adam meaning humankind, so it's kind of a pun. God made this earthy man. Again, is a hint to me that there's more going on than God grabbing some clay and forming a human out of it. This is a story about God making people from the dust. How did that happen? I think that happened through the process of biological evolution. I mean, a bit like the human humus. Humus means earth, and human, the people, the earthy people. It's kind of the same pun. Eve is named at the end of chapter 3, as is roughly around the time when Adam becomes a personal name, So you can use the word Adam in these 4 senses of the thing, humankind, the man, and a personal name. Hopefully that's clear. Before that, and before about Genesis 3 or 4, we just talk about the man and the woman. So to me, that's a sign. You've got the creation of humankind, and maybe later on in Genesis 3 and 4, you are talking about actual people. You can discuss, and I'll move. So I think some of this close reading of the text is super helpful, whether it's for a youth group or a small group or something, of actually putting, maybe even print out Genesis 1-3 with no chapter numbers and just put it in people's hands. What do you notice? What are the patterns? What are the uses of the word? Get several translations out. What are the differences? How is the word Adam used? How is the word death used? How, things like that. And then there's the thing I mentioned about the breath of life. The Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. But earlier on, to every beast of the earth, to every bird of the air, to everything that creeps on earth, everything that has the breath of life. So all the animals, including people, again, to me, it's a sign that, we're God's creatures. We're all God's creatures, like the other creatures out there. The specialness of being made in the image of God is a gift. It's a relationship. That's my view of the image of God, and a responsibility to tend and keep. It's the only job God gave us. And there are some hints that is the word perfect used in Genesis 1-3. He made this perfect world and there was no pain, it was all lovely, like a desert island without the things that could kill you stripped away. Anyone who's actually lived in the Caribbean would tell you, wear your shoes in the sea, you've got to be careful. We have this idea of the world as a sort of lovely holiday camp, but actually pre-fall, there's stuff to subdue, okay? And also, whatever you think the tree of life is, I think it's symbolic of our relationship, perfect relationship with God, a good relationship with God. Other people think it's an actual tree. Either way, there's this hint that we need this relationship or this tree in order to receive eternal life. So human death was there. The potential for death was there. It wasn't a thing that happened at the fall, is my view. So I think some of these, if you want a thoroughgoing sort of how, what about the 24 days? How do we interpret Genesis 1-3? Matt did a talk here last year, and also we've had our Dennis Alexander, John Walton, biblical scholar, Ernest Lucas, biblical scholar, all have talks on the Faraday website. And I recommend go listen, read the Faraday papers, also on the Faraday website. There are several on this topic. Essentially, I think Genesis is a theological book. That's the whole point of it. It's about who's in control, who made it, what's the meaning and purpose of our lives, what's the earth for, where is it all going? And I think starting in our exegesis of Genesis with these messages, with the theology, and rooting people in, this is what Genesis means, this is what it's here for, I think is a really helpful place. It's common ground, it's not controversial, it's equipping people to interpret Genesis properly so that they don't think the purpose of Genesis is to be a Christian answer to science that they've perceived as a threat. Genesis is a theological message. There are also other resources you can go to. The Bible Project has a lovely video series on creation. These are all on the Moodle platform. Biologos is a fantastic organization in the US that if you're in a kind of church, in evangelical church in particular, loads and loads of detailed stuff on creation and evolution. I've mentioned Dennis Alexander's book, Faraday. I've recommended some resources there. And there's also the Test of Faith series of resources, which has a module on this. mentioned the Faraday papers. I've mentioned the talks. Good. Take. So I realize what we've done is mainly be provocative and challenging and give you some things to hang your hat on before we then go into an more in-depth look at the sort of deeper questions of evolution and suffering and human evolution and things. That I hope is helpful. Quick refresher for those of you who've been to Bible college, and a starter for further investigation for those of you for whom this is a new topic. I'm going to call Hugh up. I'm going to ask to remind myself how long we've got before you get coffee.
2 minutes.
Oh no, what? Wow. Okay, we'll take a couple of questions. Sorry. I spoke for too long. We need a clock at the back of the room. Any question? Yes. Yeah. Possible. Oh, we're supposed to give you a microphone. Sorry. Cables.
So back in Nigeria, I launched a Unity in the Body of Christ study in 2019. I'm surveying about 5,000 Christians and about 350 leaders. The goal was just to understand the state of Christianity in Nigeria. And over 60% of people who responded said that their church, their local church, has taught them to be better members of the denomination than better Christians in the body.
Okay.
So on the basis of those 3 buckets you presented, where should that lie in the real sense of things? Because if you look at it from the doctrinal standpoint, if you're affiliated with a denomination that has its own doctrine, where should they draw the line in terms of you should be a Christian first before, in quotes, representing our doctrine? And I don't know if you get what I'm trying to say. So where should the line be drawn, and where should we manage excesses around that? Because it's becoming a trend in many religion markets and churches.
Yeah, and I'm very aware that in the Pentecostal and charismatic churches, including my own, this issue is much more live. So where in an Anglican church, you'll have, if you ask the question of human evolution, about 20% of people will be like, oh, I'm really uncomfortable with this. But there'll be 80% in churches like mine. So yeah, I mean, I would put the doctrine of creation in the dogma bucket, in a sense, or doctrine bucket, you know, that the basic theological messages, and I'd put the how creation happened, what mechanisms did it happen by, or what did 24-hour days mean, you know, what does the morning and evening mean? I'd put that all in the opinion bucket. I would put good hermeneutics in the doctrine bucket. I mean, my church, I think as a distinctive, we're trying to do responsible biblical interpretation. And I think if young Hugh had done a lesson on hermeneutics, I think maybe that would have helped. Would that have helped?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, if I'd been in a church where things were taught about in a slightly more nuanced way, then I would have been helped. Not that I did leave the church. I was part of a loving Christian community and family, and they basically let me find my own way, which is why I'm here today and not, I don't know, in the Caribbean island. If I can just add though, I mean, in addition to Ruth's buckets, I think there's also a question of timing. And I think hit them young is a really important way to approach this. Tomorrow we'll have a talk about some of the youth and children's work that the Faraday do. And I think trying to talk to young people when they're not even thinking about these things, to prepare them, and as they're thinking about them, to help them, is a very, very valuable way forward. I don't think in my youth group we ever had a talk about science and faith, or how to read the Bible, or how to understand Genesis. That would have helped me hugely.
Yeah. Got time for one more. Any more? Anyone online? Stunned you into silence. Yes.
Okay, so if you're comfortable with interpreting the first few chapters of Genesis in a certain way, But by the end of Genesis, we've got Joseph and Egypt, and all that seems pretty straightforward. And then somewhere near the start of Genesis, you've got Noah's Ark. So exactly which chapter do you change modes?
Yeah, good question. I mean, there's a reason why a lot of commentaries are Genesis 1 to 11, Genesis 12 to, is it 48? Because there seems like there's a change of tone between the two. And I think, although using the word history about, I speak as an evangelical who takes the Bible incredibly seriously, but they wrote their history differently then. So going in with a modern category of history to anywhere in the Bible is slightly problematic, but I think certainly I would use the word, no, I'm not. Anyway, I think you start off figurative and it gets less. I mean, Noah's Ark is another one that raised a lot of problems with people, but I think if you look at it as a story of a local deluge for people who were prepared and dealt with it, I think it makes a lot more sense than if you try and look at it with a scientific sort of view and imagine the whole world, the whole globe covered in water and things like that.
Thank you very much to Ruth and Hugh. We have tea and coffee here. I'll let you say something in a minute. And we will start back again at 4:30. But what did you want to say, Hugh?
I just wanted to say that the final example, Noah's flood, is hugely topical. There's a flood coming, nobody's taking any notice, and so on and so on. It's just a mirror of climate change, isn't it? Anyway, just wind people up a bit.